I want to talk now about the Colorado ecosystems, so how the physical features of Colorado play out in our ecosystems that we have around us. So there's three major physiographic provinces. That means areas defined by geography and physical features. So there's three that are the most prominent in Colorado: the Southern Rockies, the Great Plains, and the Colorado Plateau. The Colorado Plateau is a lot of times called the Western Slope by Coloradans. So that's a term that you'll hear on the news, for example, when they're talking about weather, things like that. And so it's the western side of the mountains. So when you're driving up into the mountains, it's after you've sort of passed the highest areas. That's what's called the Continental Divide. And once you're down off the Continental Divide on the western side, that's the Western Slope. And once you get out of the actual mountain forests, you enter into this Colorado Plateau region. It's very dry and sparse vegetation, especially where it's not irrigated. So I do want to address that there's quite a bit of farming that happens on the Western Slope. So for example, that's where all of our peaches come from, our famous Colorado peaches, Colorado apples. There's quite a bit of hay farming that goes on the Western Slope. And that's all made possible by irrigation. The native landscape is very dry. And then basically with irrigation, they can plant up here. They plant peaches or grapes, for example, are also grown in Colorado on the Western Slope by using irrigation. But it's actually very dry without that irrigation. You get these really dramatic scenery from the erosion by wind and water over long periods of time, and the wind eroding it because it is so dry. And you also have these sort of characteristic red and yellow colors to the canyons. This is also like this appearance of landscape in this physiographic province really extends into Utah. So if you've ever been to Moab or Arches National Park, you see this kind of scenery there as well. The Southern Rockies are the mountains that we always talk about in Colorado. So whenever we say the mountains in Colorado, we always mean the Southern Rockies. They really crisscross. They go all the way from the north side of the state to the south side of the state. And the Rockies themselves, the Rocky Mountains, continue very far north up towards Canada. So the Rocky Mountains are a huge mountain range. And we're in the Southern Rockies, which is the highest part of the Rocky Mountains. If you're in the Rockies in other places, like for example, I've been in the Rockies in places like Idaho and Montana, it's kind of funny because their mountain passes are much lower elevation. So like a mountain pass in Idaho is at 6,000 feet above sea level, which of course in Colorado, that's Denver. That's not even our mountains. That's down off the mountains. So this is the highest part of the Rocky Mountain chain. Colorado has 53 14ers. 14ers is the kind of the cute name for mountains that are over 14,000 feet in elevation. Again, there's not that many of these in the mountain range. Most of them are in Colorado. And so in Colorado, running across the Rocky Mountains is the Continental Divide. And so the Continental Divide is this high point in the mountains. And the significance of it, and you could kind of imagine it going from peak to peak. And in fact, there is something called the Continental Divide Trail, which is a hiking trail at high elevation. And the significance of it is that on one side of the Continental Divide, the eastern side, all of the water that falls on that side of the divide will drain eventually to the Mississippi. So it doesn't immediately go to the Mississippi. So for example, it drains into the Platte River, but then the Platte River eventually drains into another river that eventually drains into the Mississippi. And so once it makes its way to the Mississippi River, it eventually drains into the Gulf of Mexico. So we could also say that on the eastern side of the Continental Divide, all of the water eventually ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. On the western side of the Continental Divide, all of that water eventually makes its way into the Pacific Ocean. So for example, into the Colorado River, and then eventually making its way to a sea, I'm blanking on the name right now, sorry, that is connected to the Pacific Ocean. And then out of the mountains, east of the mountains, you have the Great Plains. And so Denver is really the beginning of the Great Plains. It's kind of more famous for being the gateway to the Rockies, but it's also the gateway to the plains, because the Great Plains extend all the way from here to Kansas City, with a dramatic drop in elevation over that time. So Denver's at 5280 above sea level, and it will drop 4,000 feet lower than Denver. The shift from mountains to Great Plains sort of scenery is very dramatic and immediate, because you're like dropping out of the mountains really fast, like you're in Morrison, then you're in Golden, and then you're in Denver, and that's really a relatively quick and abrupt change in the scenery. And because of this dramatic elevation drop. And the Great Plains looks very different. So of course it's famous for being flat. So this is like a Colorado plains scene. So we see some things like yucca. This is blooming yucca right here. This is rabbit brush or sage, I can't quite tell, mixed in with the grasses. And so this is like our higher elevation, sometimes called high desert, because it's really dry grassland. Colorado's climate is what's called a continental climate. That means there's no body of water. So there's no ocean or large lake. And remember, those are moderating to temperatures. So without a large body of water, you're more prone to big fluctuations and variability in your climate. And then, of course, our other big impact is that we have a mountain range. So we get the adiabatic cooling from high elevation areas, as well as this effect on precipitation. The rain shadow. So it's sunny in Colorado with warm summers and cool winters. Colorado is known for having mostly sunny days, so most of our days have sunshine. And then, as I said, it's strongly influenced by elevation. So not only does the temperature get cooler at higher elevations, but we also see greater precipitation at higher elevations. So most of the precipitation in Colorado falls in the mountains. We also see higher wind velocities at higher altitude as well. So the precipitation in Colorado follows like three general patterns, and you will maybe recognize some of these from your own experience. So orographic precipitation is the kind of precipitation that is caused by moist air coming from the Pacific. So we have a storm, or clouds coming from the Pacific moving across the continental United States eastward, and then they hit the mountains, and as they hit the mountains, they drop most of their snow on the western side, and then and around the peaks, and then by the time they get over here, they've lost most of their precipitation. So by the time you get to the plains, there's almost no precipitation from orographic precipitation in Colorado. This is what we typically get in the wintertime. So most of our snow is up in the mountains. We get a big snowpack that forms in the mountains. Upslope circulation, or upslope precipitation, is when we have storms that move up from the Gulf of Mexico. So they're coming from the southeast and then moving towards us. And they tend to swoop and get pushed back by the mountains. And so these types of storms will generally bring more precipitation to the eastern side of the mountains and the plains. And we are more likely to get this kind of storm in the spring and the fall. So especially in the springtime, this is when we'll get the times when we have like this really heavy snowfall in Denver, but not that much snow in the mountains. And it might be more of that kind of thick, heavy snow. That's kind of really wet rather than that powdery, dry snow. And then the other type of precipitation that we get are convective storms. So when the temperatures are high, rising air will, the temperature's warming on the land, and that warm air will rise off the land, and this causes like spinning air, and these are called convective storms. And then that warm air will then condense and cause the thunderstorms, big thunderstorms that we get in the summertime. So this is where our summertime precipitation comes from. So the largest amount of precipitation is from this orographic precipitation. And even though it mostly happens in the mountains, everyone in Colorado is primarily dependent on this type of precipitation, because when you're down in Aurora or Denver metro area, your water is not coming from rain that falls in Aurora. It's almost all coming from the mountains, and it's water that was dropped in the wintertime. So when people are talking about the snowpack, they're a lot of times talking about how much snow is there, because that's going to be the amount of water that Aurora has to drink and water their grass in the summertime. So even though it doesn't fall in our area, because we have a massive water delivery system that delivers water from the mountains, we're really dependent on that orographic precipitation. So in Colorado, ecosystems tend to follow a predictable pattern based on elevation, because elevation has such a strong influence on temperature and moisture. So we see that the different ecosystems that are present in Colorado will mostly follow, like, okay, low elevation, slightly higher, slightly higher, slightly higher. And so the species and organisms that are present in those areas will depend on the temperature and elevation because of the precipitation. And so just as a really dramatic example, if we consider just the presence of trees, we see that in Colorado, we really only have forests between the elevation 5,600 and 11,000. So slightly higher than Denver is where the forests begin, but then they'll only go as high as 11,000 feet. If you go any higher than 11,000 feet, you don't have forest anymore. And if you're below 5,600 feet, you don't have forest anymore. And so the reason for that is different in the different areas. So at high elevation, above 11,000 feet, it's too cold, dry, and windy for trees. So they'll stop being able to grow. And this is sometimes called above tree line. So if you're in the mountains or hiking or something like that, people might talk about being above tree line. That's when you no longer have trees. You come out of the forest and you're in this windy, dry, cold area. And then in the lowest elevation, so below 5,600 feet, so this is now in Denver in the plains, it's too dry for the evergreen forests. So the major ecosystem types in Colorado are listed here. Basically, we have grasslands, we have riparian areas, which are along water, and then we have different types of trees and shrubs that will exist at various elevations. So these are different elevation levels. So I'm just going to briefly go through these just for your own kind of awareness of your landscape. The goal of this is not for you to memorize the types of trees that grow in a subalpine forest, just to be clear, but more for you to be able to describe the place that you live. So the grasslands are devoid of trees except near riparian areas, that's near water. This is most common below 5,600 feet. So there's two types in Colorado, the low elevation ones, which are depicted here. This is the plains grassland. This is actually Pawnee National Grasslands, which is just east of Greeley. And then you can also have mountain grasslands and meadows. These are oftentimes sort of interspersed among forest ecosystems or in like a big opening in a forest ecosystem. So this, for example, is a picture of North Park. North Park is basically a humongous grassland in the middle of the mountains. South Park is also the same thing. It's a big meadow. So is Estes Park. So that name park actually was used to describe a big meadow when people were first migrating, when white settlers, European settlers were first migrating into Colorado. Riparian ecosystems can exist anywhere throughout Colorado. They're really distinctive areas along streams, rivers, ponds, and lakes. So we have riparian areas throughout Aurora, lining, for example, Tollgate Creek, Sand Creek, along the rivers, so the Platte River running through Denver, and along some of our reservoirs. So even though our lakes aren't natural, they have become riparian areas for wildlife. So Aurora Reservoir, for example, has a riparian strip around it. And these can differ based on where they are. So they don't look the same. They're a little bit different in the organisms that are present, like here in Aurora versus up in the mountains. And then we have specific aquatic ecosystems. That's what actually lives in the water. So things that actually swim in the water. In the mountains, you have riparian areas with maybe distinct types of trees compared to the surrounding forest. In lower land areas, like in the plains, the riparian areas will oftentimes be the only area with trees. So if you look across the Great Plains, you will find, for example, cottonwood trees only right along where there's creeks. Other than that, there'll be no trees present. Shrublands are a diverse group of ecosystems that exist at different elevations. Shrubs are just basically smaller trees, so they're woody like a tree, but they tend to be more branching and don't get as tall. In Colorado, we have several types of shrublands that differ in like the elevation and moisture levels that they'll tolerate. So semi-desert being kind of our driest shrublands, sagebrush shrublands being kind of low elevation mountain areas, and montane shrublands being a little bit higher. This is a picture of, I'm blanking on it. It's mountain ash, I think. Yeah, I think it's mountain ash. And then at a slightly higher elevation, we have pinyon pine juniper woodlands. We see these, so the two dominant species are the pinyon pine, which is here. There's the pine nut. You've probably eaten a pine nut at some point. It comes from pinyon pines. And then here's juniper berries on a juniper. If you're driving out of Denver, this is like one of the first ecosystems you'll see once you leave as you head into higher elevation. You also see it on the western slope quite a bit as you come down from the highest peaks. So they're kind of the lowest elevation forests. Montane forests are a little bit higher usually than the pinyon pine juniper woodlands. These are kind of the other really common one that you'll see if you're just driving a little bit into the mountains. So ponderosa pines, Douglas firs, aspens, and lodgepole pines. So if you've been into the mountains at all, and you've probably most likely been in this type of forest. This is the most common type. If you're a little more adventurous and you hike a little bit more, then you're more likely to end up in these higher elevations. So above 9,000 feet, you enter the subalpine forest. This has things like Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, limber pine, bristlecone pine. And because this goes all the way to tree line, you are more likely to see what are called Krumholtz forms. And you can see these pictures here. This is a kind of a more dried out one. This is kind of showing more of the living branches on it. But notice that there's kind of this twisting of the trunk, and you see like a limitation in growth. Like this only has green on one side of the tree. These Krumholtz growth forms will occur right at tree line, so they're the very edge of where trees can survive, and you can see they're barely surviving. They get like a wind blowing on them so hard that they can only grow on the side that isn't getting the wind all the time. So basically, the way this tree is growing tells me that the wind is always blowing from like somewhere around here and hitting the tree this way, and that allows the growth to be on the other side. So once you go higher than the subalpine forest, and so again, maybe some of you who are more adventurous have maybe been above tree line. So if you've been to the top of Mount Evans, for example, or climbed a 14er, you reach the alpine tundra. It's very cold here. It's very dry. It's very windy. There's no trees anymore. And a lot of times, because it's the top of a mountain, it's very rocky. So all you see is very, very, very low growing stuff. So it almost looks like moss. It's not moss, but it's so small it looks like moss. And so in the respect that there's not any trees anymore, sometimes it's like the plains, but again, it's a very different type of plant. And so that's just a brief introduction to Colorado's ecosystems.